A simple gesture of compassion can change the fate of entire tribes. The Arizona sun was beating down on the parched land when Jack Carpenter spotted the small body lying among the thorny bushes. The hot wind carried the smell of death that he knew all too well, but something at that moment made him dismount from his bay horse. His boots stomped on the scorching sand as he slowly approached, his hand instinctively resting on the handle of his revolver. The Apache boy must not have been more than 12 years old. He was lying on his side, his lips chapped with thirst, his chest rising and falling in weaker and weaker movements. A bullet wound ran through his right shoulder, and the blood had already dried under the relentless sun. All around, the footprints of horses told the story. Soldiers had passed by, leaving the boy to die alone in the desert. Jack looked around, checking that there were no other Apaches around. The territory had been at war for months, and finding a wounded Indian could mean an ambush. But when his eyes turned to the boy, he saw only a child dying. Without thinking twice, he unrolled the canteen from his belt and knelt on the hot sand. The fresh water touched the boy's lips, who opened his eyes for the first time. They were eyes as dark as night, full of pain, but also of a dignity that impressed Jack. The boy drank a few small sips, and Jack wet a piece of cloth to clean the wound on his shoulder. While tending to the wound, Jack realized that he was no longer alone. One shadow moved between the distant rocks, then another. The Apaches had arrived quietly, like desert ghosts. He could feel dozens of eyes watching his every move, but he kept cleaning the boy's wound as if nothing had changed. The boy whispered something in Apache, and Jack didn't need to understand the words to know it was a thank you. When he finished making a makeshift bandage, he helped the boy sit against a rock in the shade. She left the canteen next to him and stood up slowly, her hands away from her weapons. It was then that he saw the first Apache warrior come out from behind the rocks. He was a tall man, with war paint on his face and a spear in his hand. Then others came, until Jack found himself surrounded by at least 20 armed Indians. Silence weighed down the warm air like a storm about to collapse. The Apache chief, a gray-haired man with old scars on his chest, walked to where Jack was standing. His eyes studied the cowboy for a long moment, then descended to the wounded boy who was drinking water from the canteen. The boy spoke again in his native language, and Jack saw something change on the chief's face. Without a word, the older Apache made a hand gesture. The warriors put down their weapons. The chief approached Jack and placed a hand on his shoulder. It was not a gesture of threat, but of recognition. Then he and 2 other men carried the wounded boy carefully, disappearing among the rocks as quietly as they had arrived. Jack was left alone in the desert once again, the sun beginning to set on the horizon. He mounted his horse and continued his journey, not knowing that those few minutes of compassion were about to change everything. What would happen that night would shake the foundations of the war between Apaches and white men, proving that sometimes a single act of kindness is worth 1,000 battles. The stars began to appear in the sky when Jack lit his fire near a stream. He did not know that 200 Apache warriors were gathered in the nearby mountains, deciding his fate and that of the entire region. The boy he saved was the grandson of the great chief Tokoye, and his word carried weight among the warriors. Lone Cowboy offered water to a dying Apache boy. That night, 200 warriors did the unthinkable. Part 2. Jack woke up to the sound of hooves approaching. The fire had been reduced to faint embers, and the full moon illuminated the camp with a silvery light. He rolled silently behind a rock, the revolver already in his hand. The years of living in Apache territory had taught him to sleep with one eye open. 3 horsemen emerged from the darkness, cavalry soldiers, by the silhouettes of their uniforms and the glow of their sabers in the lunar light. Jack recognized Captain Morrison at the head, a man known for his cruelty to the Indians. The other 2 were veteran sergeants, faces hardened by desert warfare. Morrison dismounted and walked to the embers of the campfire. His eyes searched for Jack in the darkness, but the cowboy remained hidden, watching. The captain kicked the embers, spreading sparks across the barren ground. The military knew Jack was nearby. His horse's footprints were easy to follow in the sand. Morrison walked around the camp, checking every shadow, every rock that could serve as a hiding place. His men remained mounted, rifles at the ready. Jack could have shot. 3 well-aimed shots, and he would be free of the problems that these men brought. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the memory of the Apache boy's eyes, or maybe it was just the fatigue of so much violence. He put the gun away and stepped out of the shadows. Morrison smiled when he saw Jack emerge from behind the rocks. It was a cold smile, humorless. The captain had been chasing Apaches for 5 years, and he knew how to recognize someone who had recently had contact with them. There was something about Jack's way of moving, a caution that only came from those who had been close to death. The 2 men measured themselves in silence. Morrison was younger, but he carried the arrogance of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. Jack was a survivor, scarred by the scars of countless conflicts. The tension between them was palpable in the cold night air. The captain finally spoke about Apache patrols in the region. There were reports of unusual movement in the mountains, warriors gathering in larger numbers than usual. He wanted to know if Jack had seen anything during his trip. His questions were seemingly casual, but Jack could see the distrust behind every word. Jack lied easily. He said that he had not seen any Apache, that his trip had been peaceful. Morrison didn't believe it, but he had no proof. The captain walked around the extinguished campfire, his eyes always coming back to Jack, like a predator studying his prey. It was then that one of the sergeants pointed to something in the sand. Small footprints, barefoot, child's footprints. Jack felt his stomach tighten, but kept his expression neutral. Morrison knelt down to examine the marks more closely, following the trail to where he had cared for the injured boy. The captain found drops of dried blood in the sand. His suspicions were confirmed when he discovered pieces of the cloth that Jack had used to clean the wound. Morrison stood up slowly, his face now a mask of restrained fury. He knew that Jack had helped an Apache, and that was wartime treason. Jack realized that the situation had changed. Morrison's hand hovered over the pistol, and the 2 sergeants had directed their rifles in his direction. The cowboy calculated his chances. 3 armed men, positioned so that he could not hit everyone before being fatally shot. But before anyone could pull the trigger, the sound of drums echoed through the mountains. It was a slow, solemn rhythm that seemed to come from all directions at once. Morrison and his men looked around nervously. They knew that sound. It was an Apache call of war, but unlike anything they had ever heard. The drums stopped as suddenly as they had begun. The silence that followed was even more disturbing. Jack knew that something important was happening in the mountains, something related to the boy he had saved. Morrison knew it too, and his paranoia grew by the second. The captain decided he couldn't risk letting Jack free. He ordered the sergeants to tie him up. Jack couldn't resist, knowing that any sudden movement would result in his death. But as the ropes tightened his wrists, he watched the distant mountains, where hundreds of campfires began to glow in the darkness. Something monumental was happening in Apache territory. The simple gesture of giving water to an injured boy had set off a chain of events that none of them could have predicted. And Jack Carpenter, tied up and prisoner, was at the center of it all, not knowing whether he would be a hero or a victim of what was to come. The dawn brought a surprise that no white man had witnessed in decades of war. Jack was awakened by the silence. A silence so deep that it seemed unnatural in the desert that always vibrated with wildlife. Morrison and his men slept restlessly around the dead campfire, but Jack remained alert, even though he was tied up. There was something different in the air, a tension that made the horses neigh nervously. When the first rays of sunlight touched the distant mountains, Jack saw something that made him question if he was still dreaming. A long line of Apache warriors descended the rocky slopes. They did not come running or screaming as in war attacks. They walked slowly in single file, each carrying something in their hands. Morrison awoke to the restless neigh of his horse. The captain stood up quickly, his hand instinctively going to the gun, but stopped in mid-motion. His eyes widened when he saw the Apache procession descending from the mountains. There were hundreds of them, more warriors gathered than he had seen in his entire military career. The two sergeants woke up to Morrison's urgent whispers. Soon, the three soldiers were on their feet, rifles pointed at the Apache approach, but their hands trembled. They had never faced such large numbers, and the peaceful way in which the Indians approached was even more disconcerting than a direct attack. Jack watched everything with growing fascination. The warriors carried green branches, desert wildflowers, small pots of water. Symbols of peace and offerings he had never seen Apaches offer to white men. Something extraordinary was happening, and he knew he was connected to the injured boy he had met the day before. The leader of the procession was the same grey-haired chief Jack had seen on the rocks. The man walked with dignity, without haste, his eyes fixed on the small group of white men. Behind him came the boy Jack had saved, now standing and walking, his wounded arm in a sling made of leather and medicinal plants. Morrison whispered orders to his men to prepare to fight, but when more than 200 warriors appeared on the horizon, all walking in the same peaceful procession, he realized that resisting would be suicide. His hand slowly let go of the rifle, and he watched the approach with a mixture of terror and curiosity. The Apache chief stopped just 10 paces away. His warriors spread out in a semicircle, but kept their guns down. The silence lasted for long minutes while the two groups studied each other. Jack could feel the historical weight of the moment, knowing that he was witnessing something that would forever change relations between Apaches and white men in that region. The injured boy stepped forward. His words were in Apache, but he pointed to Jack and made gestures that clearly told the story of the previous day. How the cowboy had found him dying, as he had given water and care of the wound. How kind he had been when he could have just walked right by. The Apache chief looked straight into Jack's eyes. It was a look that seemed to penetrate the soul, assessing not only recent actions, but the man's character. Jack held his gaze, not with defiance, but with honesty. There was nothing to hide about what he had done. Then something happened that Morrison would never fully report in his official dispatches, because no one would believe it. The Apache chief approached Jack and cut his ropes with a sharp knife. Then he took a necklace of colored beads from his neck and placed it around the cowboy's neck. It was a symbol of protection and respect that few white men had received in history. The warriors began to deposit their offerings around Jack, green branches, flowers, small sacred objects. Morrison and his men watched in paralysis, not fully understanding what they were witnessing. It was a ceremony of gratitude and recognition, something that transcended cultural barriers and the wounds of war. The Apache chief spoke in his native tongue, and although Jack did not understand the words, the tone and gestures made the meaning clear. He was being accepted as a friend of the Apaches, protected by the entire tribe. But more than that, his act of compassion had touched something deep in Apache culture, something related to the protection of children and the value of human life. When the ceremony was over, the chief approached Morrison. The captain instinctively retreated, but the Apache showed no hostility. In broken English, he explained that Jack was now under tribal protection. Any damage done to him would be considered an act of war against all Apaches in the region. Morrison knew he was facing a situation that was impossible to explain to his superiors. How could he report that a lone cowboy had achieved in one day what the American army had failed to achieve in years of conflict? How to explain that 200 Apache warriors had gathered not for war, but to honor a white man? The Apaches withdrew as quietly as they had arrived, leaving Jack free and Morrison with a gigantic political problem. The captain knew he couldn't arrest Jack now, not after what he had witnessed, but he also knew that his military career was in jeopardy if the truth about the events spread. The following weeks brought changes that no one had anticipated in the Arizona territory. Jack had ridden the same trails as always, but now he was a different man. The Apache necklace around his neck attracted curious and suspicious looks in the cities he passed. Merchants whispered when he entered the establishments. Soldiers watched him with a mixture of respect and suspicion. His reputation had spread faster than a fire on the dry prairie. Morrison had tried to keep the events a secret, but the truth has its own way of revealing itself. The soldiers spoke, the traders speculated, and soon the entire region knew that a cowboy had received Apache protection in a way never seen before. Some called Jack a hero, others a traitor. He was still simply a man who had given water to a thirsty child. The military fort where Morrison served was in an uproar. Colonel Patterson had called an emergency meeting with all the officers in the area. The news that 200 Apache warriors had gathered peacefully had reached Washington, and there was now political pressure to understand what really happened in the desert. Jack was summoned to testify at the fort. He rode there knowing that his life could change completely after that conversation. The soldiers in the guardhouses watched him curiously as he passed through the wooden gates. It was strange to be inside military walls wearing an Apache symbol around his neck. Colonel Patterson was a man of 60, a veteran of many campaigns against Indians. His hands were scarred with battles, and his grey eyes had seen more death than any man should see. When Jack walked into his office, Patterson studied the Apache necklace with fascination and suspicion. The conversation lasted for hours. Jack told his version of events without omitting details, from the moment he found the injured boy to the warrior's gratitude ceremony. Patterson asked specific questions, trying to find inconsistencies or ulterior motives. But Jack's story was too simple to invent. The colonel revealed information that changed Jack's perspective on recent events. The boy he had saved was not just any Apache child. He was the grandson of the great chief Tokoye, a spiritual leader respected by all the tribes of the region. The child had gotten lost from the group during an attack by soldiers and was injured trying to escape. Patterson explained that the Apaches believed that saving the life of a child, especially the grandson of the spirit chief, was a sacred act that deserved divine protection. That is why the ceremony had been so elaborate and involved so many warriors. Jack had inadvertently touched something deep in Apache culture, something that transcended the politics of war. But there was more. Military spies reported that the Apache tribes were meeting to discuss a truce. Jack's act had served as a catalyst for peace talks that had been stalled for years. Some chiefs saw in this gesture proof that not all white men were enemies, that perhaps there was hope for coexistence. The colonel offered Jack an official position as an intermediary between the army and the Apache tribes. It was a unique opportunity to help establish lasting peace in the region, but it also meant that Jack would become the target of both Apaches, who still wanted war, and white men, who profited from the conflict. Jack asked for time to think. He left the fort with many questions in his head. His life had been simple until he found that injured boy. Now he was at the center of a possible revolution in relations between two cultures that seemed destined for eternal war. The weight of responsibility was overwhelming. That night, camped under the desert stars, Jack reflected on the paths that life offers. He could simply ride away, seek new territories where his reputation did not follow him, or he could accept the role that fate had placed in his hands and try to build something better than war and death. The distant sound of Apache drums echoed through the mountains once more, but now Jack recognized the rhythm. It was not a call to war. It was a song of hope, a melody that spoke of possibilities that had seemed impossible just a few weeks before. The boy he had saved something much greater in return. As the campfire slowly died down, Jack made his decision. He had begun that journey as a lonely man with no definite direction. But the desert had shown that sometimes the fate of many can depend on the choices of one, and he was ready to take on that responsibility, regardless of the price he might pay. 6 months later, the Arizona Territory witnessed something that the history books would call a miracle. Jack Carpenter was standing in the center of a green valley where a small stream cut through the red earth. On one side, 50 American cavalry soldiers were waiting in formation. On the other, 100 Apache warriors mounted on their painted horses watched in silence. Between the two groups, a simple wooden table had been placed under the shade of a solitary oak tree. Colonel Patterson was present, as was the great Chief Cowboy, an imposing man with white hair and eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of centuries. But all eyes were on Jack, the man who had made that historic moment possible. Around his neck, the Apache necklace glistened in the midday sun. The boy Jack had saved, now completely recovered, ran up to him with a smile on his face. His presence there symbolized everything that was being built. A life spared had become the bridge between two cultures that seemed destined for eternal war. The boy held Jack's hand, a simple gesture that spoke louder than any speech. The treaty documents were ready on the table. Terms that guaranteed land for the Apaches, safe trade routes for white men, and the promise that conflicts would be resolved through dialogue rather than violence. Jack had spent months traveling between tribes and military forts, building trust word by word, gesture by gesture. Not everything had been easy. Some warriors still advocated war, believing that white men would never honor promises. Some soldiers saw any agreement as a sign of weakness. Jack had faced death threats from both sides, but his resolve never wavered. The Apache boy had shown him that compassion could change destinies. As Chief Cowboy approached the table to sign the treaty, he stopped in front of Jack. In careful English, he thanked the man who had saved his grandson and, in doing so, paved the way for peace. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of generations of conflict that were finally coming to an end. Colonel Patterson also acknowledged Jack's crucial role in mediation. A simple man who had given water to a thirsty child achieved what experienced diplomats and veteran generals had failed to achieve. Sometimes the most profound solutions are born from the most human gestures. The signing of the treaty was followed by a mixed ceremony, combining Apache and American military traditions. Warriors and soldiers shared food and stories for the first time in decades. Apache children played near the cavalry horses, while their parents talked to officers about the future. But the most emotional moment came when the Apache boy, now calling Jack his honorary uncle, handed him a special gift. It was a small whistle made of bone and decorated with colorful feathers. The boy explained in Apache, translated by his grandfather, that the whistle was used to call for protection from the spirits when Jack was in danger. As the sun set over the Valley of Peace, Jack reflected on the journey that had begun with a simple act of humanity. He had not planned to become a historical mediator. He had only seen a child suffering and done what any decent person would do. But the desert had transformed that moment into something much bigger. Years later, when storytellers talked about the Great Arizona Treaty, they always mentioned Jack Carpenter, the cowboy who proved that compassion can be more powerful than any weapon. Its story became legend, passed down from generation to generation by both Apache families and American settlers. The boy grew up to become a respected leader, always reminding both peoples about the power of kindness. Jack continued to live in the now peaceful territory, serving as an advisor whenever disagreements arose. He never married or had children of his own, but he considered all the children in the area to be his family. In the last decades of his life, Jack used to sit on the porch of his small house and watch Apache and American children playing together on the fields that were once battlefields. The Apache necklace still hung around his neck, now faded by time, but still symbolizing the bridge a man had built between seemingly irreconcilable worlds. When Jack died at the age of 82, his funeral was a historic event. Apache warriors and American soldiers carried his coffin side by side. The boy he had saved, now a middle-aged man, spoke about how a water canteen had changed the fate of an entire region. The desert holds many stories of violence and death, but Jack Carpenter's story proved that it can also be a stage for redemption and hope. Sometimes when the wind blows through the mountains of Arizona, old locals swear they can still hear the sound of the bone whistle that the Apache boy gave to the man who chose compassion over indifference. If this story of compassion and transformation has touched your heart, you can't miss our upcoming epic adventures of the American Wild West, where lonely men face choices that change destinies and small gestures create great revolutions in the history of the wilderness. Subscribe to the channel to follow more exciting narratives of cowboys, Apaches, and moments that defined the character of the West. And leave your comment below telling what was the most impactful moment of this Jack Carpenter journey for you.